Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening, Professor Ellis. Welcome to the Academy for Leadership in Teacher Education International Webinar Series for Exemplary Scholarship, organized by the Faculty of Education, the University of Hong Kong. My name is Crystal, and I'm the MC of today. We are honored to have Professor Viv Ellis, Dean of the Faculty of Education at Monash University, Australia, with us today to deliver a lecture titled A New Political Economy of Teacher Development, England as Eccentric Outlier or Game-Changing Forerunner. Before we start, I would like to introduce some house rules. First of all, in order to avoid unnecessary noise throughout the session, we have muted all of you and your cameras are turned off as the default setting. This lecture is also broadcast live from our faculty Facebook page and YouTube channel. It will also be recorded for uploading onto different faculty online platforms after the lecture as well. The Q&A session is exclusive for participants who have registered for this webinar. In this session, please type your questions in the Q&A chat box so that we can help you ask the questions. Please note that the raise hand function will not be responded. For the rundown, Professor Ellis will first deliver the lecture for around an hour. After that, there will be around 30 minutes for the Q&A session. Now, may I invite Professor Aileen Goodwin, Dean of Faculty of Education, to give a welcome remarks. Professor Goodwin, please.
Thank you so much, Crystal. So good afternoon, everyone, and good evening to those of you who are tuning in from Australia. I'm sure there are lots of folks from Monash in our audience. It is my great privilege and pleasure to welcome and introduce Professor Viv Ellis. So I'm going to just share with you a brief bio for Professor Ellis, who is a global expert on teacher education, having worked with government agencies and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, across the UK, Europe, Asia, and Australia, and most recently has been engaged with the Norwegian government's reforms to upper primary and lower secondary initial teacher education. Prior to joining Monash, and I think you've been at Monash just about a year, he was at King's College London, professor in teacher education, and founding co-director of the Center for Innovation in Teacher Education and Development, cited a strategic partnership between KCL and Teachers College, Columbia University, where he also holds an honorary research professorship. So this is an unusual bio in the sense that it's only about 5 lines long, and it ought to be about 50 lines long because Professor Ellis has a long list of everything, a long list of publications, a long career as a researcher. As his bio said, he is in great demand internationally. And so it is really a privilege and an honor that he has chosen to spend some time with us. I am very happy to see him because the pandemic has meant that we're not able to travel as much, and I certainly am missing some of our delightful times together. In fact, the last time was probably 2019, when I remember that very, very hot day when we're out in Central and eating everywhere and drinking lovely mango drinks and just having a great time. So hopefully those great times will come back to us and look forward to those. Professor Ellis will talk today about teacher education in a current context that is fluctuating and also has some relevance, I think, for many locations and contexts, including Hong Kong. So I will pass over. Please join me in welcoming Professor Viv Ellis.
Thank you very much, Professor Goodwin. A very generous introduction. I'll share my screen. Could I just check that that's working okay?
It is.
Yeah. Great, okay. Thank you very much for that introduction and to the Academy for Leadership in Teacher Education at the University of Hong Kong. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I speak today, the sovereignty of that was never ceded. And I'd like to specifically acknowledge that it's the communities of the Kulin Nation who are the ongoing custodians of the land on which this university stands. And I and my colleagues pay our respects to our research, teaching, and learning to their elders, past and present. So the title tonight the New Political Economy of Teacher Development, asks a question whether England is an eccentric outlier, just a bit of an oddity, or whether the experimentation that's gone on in England is perhaps a forerunner that would change the game about how we prepare teachers in the initial stage of their career, but more specifically in relation to tonight's presentation, continuing professional development. So I'm going to draw on research that was completed for the PETE project, the Political Economy of Teacher Education, which was started back in London. And I also want to acknowledge people with whom I worked there. So particularly Sarah Stedman, who is a postdoctoral research fellow funded by the ESRC, Warwick Mansell, who is an education journalist who runs the Education Uncovered website, Tom Ara Trippestad from Western Norway University of Applied Sciences, and David Spendlove from the University of Manchester in England. And the articles that have come out of the PETE study are available on my website at that address. So if anything if anything is of interest in terms of the data, or you want to find out more about the methodology, or you're interested more in the arguments, then you can read the publications. The links are on that URL. The focus on political economy is, I hope, and I think, distinctive. We were interested when we were thinking about how initial and continuing teacher development was changing, about the interaction of political ideas and economic processes within the cultural context of education systems, and how power and privilege was distributed within those systems. And it's somewhat different to the sort of policy sociology work of someone like Stephen Ball, whose work I greatly respect and I will cite this evening, because it asks whether those changing patterns of participation are also represented in changing distributions of economic resources. The focus in PETE was on the political and political ideas, but it differs from the wonderful work of someone like Helen Gunter in that it engages with the complexity of education as an economic activity, So to that extent, it is somewhat similar to the approach, cultural political economy approach, of Susan Robertson and Roger Dale. The other thing to say is that I am talking about England, and that's really important. So I'm talking about England, not because it's shorthand for the UK, but because it's a specific part of the UK. And you will be familiar with the other countries, nations of the UK, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and England being, if you like, the core. And I use the language of core deliberately because very often Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland in the history of British colonialism have been referred to as the peripheral parts of the British Isles. So over the last 100 years or so, particularly in a country like Scotland, the education system has developed very separately to England. And since the end of the 20th century, Wales has had devolved powers, and what's going on in Wales is very different. And Northern Ireland is also different. So in those devolved institutions, and you might be familiar with, arguments for the independence of a country or a nation like Scotland, what's going on in education, what's going on in teacher education is different. And I'm dwelling on that because sometimes people refer to the UK and they talk about what's going on in England, and it's not the same. In fact, you could point to a country like Wales, or a nation like Wales, part of the UK, and you could find some radically different policies, both in terms of schools and in terms of teacher education. Oops. Okay, so teacher education and our interest in studying it from a political economy perspective recognizes that teacher education has been implicated in nation building. So that is particularly true in colonial contexts, including in Ireland, but also in Australia and Canada, where textbooks and teacher education colleges were produced to create teachers who in turn would create good British subjects amongst the children of the empire. Teacher education is also been a necessary part of a mass public education system. So in England in the mid-19th century, with the decision to offer universal primary education, then you needed a system to prepare the teachers. So public education systems, universal mass public education systems, to use the shorthand, are part of a state or a welfare state policy infrastructure. But increasingly, teacher education has become a tool of economic as well as social policy, where the quality of teaching, or indeed sometimes the quality of teachers, is defined by effectiveness and efficiency within a neoliberal imaginary. So an approach which is absolutely something we're all part of, whether we resist neoliberalism or not, is part of that kind of marketized, self-interested, competitive, liberal approach. A good example of how teacher education is signaled as an economic policy is at the end of the movie The Big Short. I don't know whether you've ever seen that, but there's a coda at the end of the movie where the character, I think that Steve Carell plays, says that after the global financial crisis, it became teachers and immigrants who were blamed for economic problems. Neoliberalism is something that people write a lot about in academia. I had a book given to me today about the neoliberal university. People make that argument a lot, and it's referred to through processes of marketization and then kind of privatization. But as I say, I'm always interested in what specific arguments people wish to make about the university or a teacher education practice as neoliberal. I think sometimes that word is applied too loosely and it doesn't have a great deal of meaning. It's just meant to represent something that we don't necessarily like. The other aspect, or the other political philosophy that I find very interesting in relation to teacher education is conservatism, and the emphasis on privatization with the use of markets to achieve particular ends. So there is a kind of model of the market within conservatism. And particularly, I'm interested in varieties of conservatism. So in England, for example, you could identify Burkeans and Peelites within the same family of conservatives. Burkeans appealing to tradition, to a kind of cultural canon, to conserving that, reproducing it, restoring it, and Peelites interested in individual enterprise and freedom and entrepreneurship. And those things are in tension, particularly in English conservatism. In education in England since 2010, you've seen the rise of a version of conservatism in educational discourse, particularly in social media, with this dichotomy between what they refer to as traditionalism and progressivism. Progressivism, loosely defined, not certainly in the sense that Dewey would have defined progressivism. Traditionalism, also often very loosely defined and shortened to trad. But nonetheless, traditionalism is also a conservative, broadly, political philosophy. Ben Teitelbaum has written a really good book about that. And traditionalism as a political philosophy is relevant to educational discourse, educational policy making in different parts of the world, including in the United States, where traditionalism as a political philosophy is associated with Steve Bannon, who was an advisor to President Trump. And in educational discourse on social media in England, you do see appeals to traditional kind of icons or iconographic ideas, such as the importance of reproducing, sustaining, restoring the canon to avoid replacement by the other, replacement by non-Western forms of knowledge, by modernity, which is resisted. So I dwell on that for a moment because it will become relevant later when I talk particularly about how since 2010, conservative and conservative liberal Democrat governments have created a very different kind of political economy for the ways that teachers are initially educated and then developed. And in relation to conservatism, Stephen Ball coined the phrase, I think it was him anyway, the reluctant state. You know, that the state has a responsibility for a number of aspects of looking after its citizens, but is reluctant to do it. And it's also another relevant concept will be the authoritarian state, not necessarily just in the use of force against its citizens, but ensuring that it controls policy, that it controls citizens and the way that they interact with public services. This is a really famous quotation in England from the work of Stephen Ball. Stephen Ball in the 90s interviewed an education secretary, a very famous one, Margaret Thatcher's education secretary, one of Margaret Thatcher's education secretaries, Sir Keith Joseph. And Ball interviewed him in 1989. And this is what Keith Joseph said: "We have a bloody state system I wish we hadn't got. I wish we'd taken a different route in 1870. We got the ruddy state involved. I don't want it. I don't think we know how to do it. I certainly don't think secretaries of state know anything about it. And we tyrannize children to do that which they don't want to do." And Ball said that later on in the interview, Keith Joseph made an argument against compulsory education completely. So that, if you like, is a really pithy statement of that very conservative, or in that case, neoconservative approach to the involvement of the state in a public service like education, even to the extent of questioning whether public education should be compulsory or mandatory. And it's related to the concept of welfare state, which is that the state plays a key role in the protection and the promotion of the economic and social well-being of its citizens. That's to do with health, education, housing, pensions, insurance against risks like ill health or unemployment, and so on. And there are different models of welfare state, and that's been studied by political theorists and anthropologists. There's one model, which is certainly the model in Australia and has been too in England, which is the market model or a liberal model, which involves outsourcing, getting private companies, private organizations to work in partnership with the state to deliver public services. And then that is contracted out on the basis of competitive tendering. So you write a specification and then people bid for that. The conservative critique of the welfare state has always been that you are encouraging the great English word, fecklessness, which is around lack of individual responsibility. If you have a safety net, if you have generous support for people against the risks of life, then you will encourage them to not have any responsibility for themselves or their family. And Herbert Spencer called that coddling the poor. So there's, again, a tradition of conservative critique of the state being involved in the provision of public services like education. Jennifer Walsh, who is now, I believe, a professor of geography at Berkeley, may have retired, but I think that's where she was when I last found out, did a really interesting study in the 80s, which was published in 1990, about the shadow state. And it's really important because now when we use the word shadow state, we very often think of conspiracy theories or spies or, you know, subterfuge, all those kinds of things. She didn't mean that at all. What Jennifer Walsh did was she studied voluntary sector. She studied voluntary organizations that provided services for children in care, homeless people, people with drug problems, and they were contracted by the state to provide those services. And Jennifer Walsh described this as part of outsourcing the public service responsibilities that had previously been held by the state to people that weren't part of the state. So her definition of shadow state was a parastate apparatus comprised of multiple voluntary sector organizations administered outside of traditional democratic politics and charged with major collective service responsibilities previously shouldered by the public sector, yet remaining within the purview of state control. In that definition, there's a really nice dynamic which I think is important, which is both pushing the responsibility out to private organizations, or in this case, the voluntary sector, but remaining committed to taking control. And Jennifer Walsh saw the shadow state as being driven both by neoliberal commitments to the market, because the argument being private organizations, third sector organizations, voluntary organizations are just more efficient. You know, they spend public money more efficiently. They're not as bloated as the public sector, which are familiar arguments in many parts of the world. But also the notion of the shadow state and the construction and production of the shadow state is driven by conservative concerns about the state intervening in all aspects of people's lives. So that's where you have a kind of concerns about the individual's liberty, about the state taking control of their lives and basically making them do things about which they don't have much choice. So if we think about teacher professional development in England and the shadow state, I'm going to identify one period which would be between 1997 and 2010. And I should say that in what I'm talking about this evening, I'm giving you an analysis of a situation. I am not giving you, and so please don't hope at the end of this that I'm going to come up with a kind of a design for teacher learning. This is analysis of a situation from a political economy perspective, which I hope is somewhat kind of historicized. But teacher professional development in the shadow state, one phase, 97 to 2010. You may have heard of the national strategies. The National Literacy Strategy came out first, and this was initiated by Tony Blair's first new Labour government. It followed his commitment in his manifesto in 97 to his three priorities being education, education, and education. And the national strategies were designed to effect a paradigm shift, first of all, in the teaching of literacy. And so that's where you have an idea like the literacy hour, where primary school lessons were planned on a weekly and a term by term and a year by year basis in folders of overhead transparencies, because this was a bit before the time of PowerPoint, where it was expected that teachers would essentially be delivering to the same kind of design. This was extremely generously funded. By 2010, £3.8 billion had been spent on the national strategies. It was highly distributed professional development through mediating shadow state structures. So that's a phrase from Walsh. So you've got the state, you have the Blair government, you've got the Blair government's Department for Education. Who does it turn to do PD for basically all the primary school teachers in England? It turns to an outsourcing company. It turns to a service organization. And one of those, a very big one, is Capita, which is very famous. Capita does lots of things. In England, for example, it takes the money that you need to pay to drive in central London, the congestion charge. It also does things like assesses people for various kinds of benefits, or it has done. So it hasn't got any quite expertise or specialism in any particular area, but it can turn its hand to delivering policy, and it will then recruit expertise if it needs to. And in this case, over 2,000 advisors were employed to mediate these training materials in local areas. And these were highly valuable contracts, 3.8 billion in total. So each contract, and they were awarded for a number of years, was highly competitive, and the providers of it, Capita was one, another organization called CFBT, the Centre for British Teachers, was another, and they were selected through fairly robust competitive tendering processes that you find in public sector procurement. Things like, what's your track record? We're going to give you £10 million to deliver professional development for teachers. Tell us what you've done before. Show us what the impact is. What differences have you made? As well as all of the other things to do with competition in terms of price, like how cheaply can you do it? And that relationship between the cost, the scale, and the effectiveness. So that went on till 2010 when New Labour lost power, and then in 2010, a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition was elected under the Prime Minister, David Cameron. Remembering, this is the second phase, 2010 on, that 2008 saw that global financial crisis. And what you saw in England, and I'm talking specifically here about England, were 10 years of austerity policies, reducing the amount of funding to the public sector. So reducing the amount of funding that was channeled to the health service, to local authorities, local government, schools, and so on. Under the guise of austerity, because we needed to ensure that the national debt didn't rise too high, that we didn't leave a burden of debt for our children, and so on. Those kinds of arguments meant that public spending was extremely parsimonious, and that there was a long period, has been a long period of austerity, which actually the COVID-19 pandemic absolutely exposed, if it hadn't already been exposed. And again, I'll come back to that at the end. The other feature of this phase of teacher professional development in the shadow state was this, what Walsh called, and remember Walsh was writing a long time before this, 20 years before this, of selective dismantling. So the production of shadow state structures, or a shadow state, involves dismantling key institutions that have provided democratic oversight for the state's delivery of public services. So in order to do what you want to do, you have to take deliberative democracy, you have to take government or regulatory oversight apart a bit, or indeed abolish it or dismantle it completely. So in this period from 2010 in England, you see the abolition of semi-independent agencies, like the Training and Development Agency for Schools. It was once called the Teacher Training Agency. And this was not part of the Government Department for Education. It was a separate agency that was meant to last over successive governments and have oversight of all initial and continuing professional development. That was abolished. The National College for Teaching and Leadership was to some extent the successor institution to that, initially focused on development of school leaders. That was abolished. The Qualifications and Curriculum Authority, which was an agency that looked after the curriculum, in England, a national curriculum under various iterations, that was abolished. The General Teaching Council for England, the GTC, which again was a semi-independent body charged with professional regulation, essentially, that was abolished. So what you saw in that first coalition Conservative Liberal Democrat government was selective dismantling, or the phrase that was used in the English press at the time was the bonfire of the quangos. Quangos are quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organizations, but it's a nice image. They basically set fire to part of the state infrastructure. And with that, in that period from 2010 in England, you see the rise of a real cultural conservatism. Very cleverly done what characterized this period too, particularly in the 2010-2014 period, was highly developed rhetorical skills, but used to promote a traditional view of teaching, a traditional view of curriculum, to some extent an approach that Stephen Ball called restorationism and referred to a curriculum of dead people. Yeah, very, very effectively promoted though, through social media channels, through political speeches, through opinion pieces in newspapers, and very effective performances in the media. I'm sorry, I should have given you a trigger warning. We thought we'd seen the last of him. I put that picture up because the person on the right is Michael Gove. You might have heard of Michael Gove. He was the Education Secretary from 2010 until around 2014, when David Cameron, the Prime Minister, decided he was so toxic to the electorate that he had to be moved to another job. But actually, Michael Gove was one of the most radical education secretaries that we've known, highly, highly disruptive, very focused on traditional views and the great tradition, the best that has been thought and said, which is a quotation from the poet Matthew Arnold, about that's what children should be taught. And this picture was taken when he interviewed, because he's a journalist, he interviewed the 45th President of the United States, I think just after the election. And there was a while there, after 2016, when Trump was elected, when British conservatives allied themselves to Trump and to Trumpism and to his version of American conservatism. Of course, after the insurrection on the Capitol, British conservatives have started to distance themselves from Mr. Trump. But I say that because there are similarities between some aspects of American conservatism, of which Trump was a symptom, and British conservatism, of which Michael Gove was one of the great kind of promoters in terms of education. One of the studies that we've done from the PEAK project was to look at probably the most significant professional development program that the Conservatives, because the coalition changed after 2015, the Conservatives took power on their own after the coalition government. So this is the most significant piece of CPD that was being available for teachers. It was called the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund, and it was announced in 2017. And the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund was meant to support continuing professional development for teachers in designated opportunity areas. So opportunity areas were basically areas of industrial decline, or a phenomenon that's particular, I think, to England and maybe the UK, which is coastal poverty, coastal deprivation. And so deindustrialized areas in decline, coastal deprivation, these areas designated as opportunity areas, and various initiatives targeted at them, one of which was the TLIF, the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund, and very focused on education as a tool to solve the problem of social mobility. Social mobility in the English context means greater participation in higher levels of education and being able to move into professional jobs or jobs that are somewhat different to ones that your parents had. So in other words, it's a mobility across class boundaries and economic boundaries. And it doesn't mean the same thing here in Australia, which is interesting, but social mobility, as opposed to social justice, is particularly emphasized in English education policy. So the argument of someone like Justine Greening, who was one of the secretaries of education who followed Gove, was that teachers are the experts who drive that. So what you need is high quality teaching in the opportunity areas where children are living in poverty, where their parents may not have jobs, where they're not living in good housing and they can't be fed. What will help them move between different classes or different kinds of economic lives is the quality of the teaching. And it was very effectively framed both by Gove and by Gove's successors as a crisis of social mobility, to some extent a crisis of equity that required radical, urgent action. And the urgency of English reforms of education and teacher education are particularly characteristic. So for this fund to improve the quality of teaching in high poverty areas, essentially, 68 organizations applied for funding. And of the 68, there were 15 universities and 2 local authorities, which are the equivalent of school districts, or in the European sense, communes. And they applied for funding. And as part of our study, we put out a call to interview people who had pitched to bid. We also put out a call to interview people who were unsuccessful in their bids. And we also interviewed people who didn't bid, but they had some interesting things to say about why they hadn't bid. So the Teaching and Leadership Fund has been the focus of some of the work that you can find on my website in terms of the articles. These are the winners of the first round of the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund. And they were the Institute for Teaching, Teach First, the Institute of Physics, Ruth Miskin Training, STEM Learning, the Teacher Development Trust, Tom Bennett Training, and Edison Learning UK. And you can see that some people did accept our invitation to participate and be interviewed. Many declined, and some didn't bother to respond. The largest amount given was 6.4 million, which, when you compare it to the 3.8 billion for the national strategy, is obviously a very small fragment of that kind of funding. But the largest amount went to an organization that actually didn't formally exist at the time that the call went out, which was an organization called the Institute for Teaching. The Institute for Teaching modeled itself on the independent graduate schools of education in the United States. One of its touch points, one of its reference points, was the Relay Graduate School of Education. What was interesting about the Institute for Teaching was that it had a great deal of publicity. It managed to get press coverage, media coverage. It got a pamphlet produced by a think tank, again, very heavily referencing the American situation. But the context, the kind of policy context, the historical context of England, really different to the United States. At that point, no real great tradition of private higher education. There are some examples of private higher education institutes in England. There are more now than there were 10, 15 years ago. But private education, higher education institutes have always been fairly marginal. I'm sure that people who work for those in England would not like me saying that. There is a university that's always been a private university, but it's small. And some would argue, including me, it doesn't necessarily perform that well. It's quite innovative in some of what it does, but it's not one of the major universities. And the other private providers too are fairly niche. They might focus on training for lawyers, for example. The other aspect of it is very difficult to award your own degrees in England. So you have to have a royal charter. There you go, another historical legacy there, to be able to award degrees, or at least you did, until the Higher Education and Funding Act of 2017. And that changed it altogether, the environment. So the Institute for Teaching, without actually existing at the time the call went out, led by a policy entrepreneur who was a Teach First, that is a Teach for America sister organization graduate, with some experience of working in the government Department for Education, with some experience, about 2.5 years of working in schools, wins £6.4 million. The next largest amount went to Teach First, which, as I've said, is the sister organisation to Teach for America under the Teach for All umbrella, and they received 3.9. Next was the Institute of Physics, which is quite an old organisation promoting physics and physics teaching as a career, with a charter, a history of a track record of activity, particularly working with physics teachers. Ruth Miskin Training, 1.6 million. Ruth Miskin has been involved in the policy sphere as a policy entrepreneur, as a highly effective kind of mediator between different governments and training for a long time, and her specialism is phonics in the teaching of reading. So Ruth Miskin is interesting because she's managed to build her organization across successive governments. STEM Learning, which began as a partnership or a kind of spin-out enterprise with science-based universities in England, became its own entity. The Teacher Development Trust started at the time of the coalition government by a secondary maths teacher who managed to win the favour of Michael Gove and set up an organisation to promote teacher professional development, winning 1.3 million. Tom Bennett Training. Tom Bennett is known well as an author focused on behaviour management. He's also equally well known as a prolific, an effective, a somewhat aggressive tweeter in English social media. He's a key figure of the traditionalist training camp, if you like, on social media in education in England. And then finally, Edison Learning UK. So Edison Learning UK is a UK offshoot of a large American public school, public sector service company. The difference with Edison Learning UK is it was set up by former school leaders. So Edison Learning UK, school leaders setting up their own business, they pitched for this and they were awarded 950,000. And you can see then who actually agreed amongst those people to be interviewed. What we then did is we looked at the kinds of organisation that won funding and how we could classify them as a type of enterprise. So as Stephen Ball has spoken about the enterprise narrative being told, enterprise as the solution to intractable or wicked social problems, ones concerned with education, attainment, social justice, social mobility. You need enterprise, you need entrepreneurs. So if you classify these teaching and leadership innovation fund organizations as enterprises, then you can come up with three categories. You can come up with the entrepreneurs. So an entrepreneur would be someone who has a good idea and then they capitalize it in the market. Ruth Miskin has a good idea. She thinks it's a good idea. She convinces enough people to think it's a good idea. She sells them the training and the materials. Ruth Miskin, from being the head teacher of a primary school, now runs a multi-million-pound training operation, including an office in New York, and very, very clever, very adept in terms of the commercial side, strikes deals with education publishers to print books that are used in the training. One of the conditions of going on the training is that people have to buy the books. I'm saying that not flippantly. I'm pointing out there really that she's very clever and very successful at doing it. And that's entrepreneurship. So I'm not dismissing entrepreneurship as an activity. I'm identifying Ruth Miskin Training as that kind of organization. Tom Bennett Training, one could argue, is also, he is an entrepreneur, except he's another sole trader, which is how Ruth Miskin started. So Tom Bennett had a niche, produced as the behavior guru, the producer of books about classroom management and behavior management. and he managed to convince people to give him the money to train other people at a whole school level and an individual level. Edison Learning UK, former teachers and school leaders that think we'll go into the CPD market. We've got experience, we've got professional experience, and we've got backing of the American company, or at least we have models that the American companies use, and we're going to go into the English market and offer CPD. The other type of enterprise we refer to as scholarly enterprises, and they would include the Institute of Physics and STEM learning. In other words, they've got a mission which is part charitable and part scholarly. They wish to study the teaching of physics, they wish to study the teaching and learning of STEM, and they wish to promote physics teaching as a career and to raise standards in physics teaching. And then there are what you might call enterprising charities, non-profits. So the entrepreneurs, they make a profit. That's what they want to do. That's how they get their income. Enterprising charities are not for profit. So the example of that I mentioned was the Institute of Teaching, which won the largest amount. Teach First, another charity, very enterprising, and the Teacher Development Trust conceived of as a charity. The person who started the Teacher Development Trust, the clue is in the word trust, didn't start it as a business, as an entrepreneur. He started it as a charity. So those are the types of enterprises that were selected to win funding from the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund. But then we decided what we wanted to do was to categorize those winners, those organizations, using the concept of, the Walsh's concept of the shadow state. So what we came up with was a continuum of different kinds of shadow state structures, that's what we called them, that varied from autonomous to co-created. So what we mean by that is an autonomous shadow state structure existed before the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund. It was very likely to exist after the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund, and it didn't rely on the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund to survive. The Institute of Physics was winning money to do CPD and other things well before this particular initiative, as was STEM learning, as indeed was Edison Learning. So there are different types of enterprises. There's an entrepreneur in there, there are scholarly enterprises in there, but the key thing about them being autonomous shadow state structures was that they have a higher degree of autonomy than the others, and they existed but were like to endure. We identified what we called intermediate shadow state structures, and these were interesting because this is where, in Ruth Miskin's case, an entrepreneur has got a good idea. The entrepreneur was working prior to this particular fund and was being relatively successful. But perhaps one of the reasons that Ruth Miskin had been relatively successful is in the previous 10 to 15 years, she had been the go-to person for successive governments around the teaching of reading in terms of policy. And she'd become part of what Helen Gunter and her colleagues have called a kind of consultocracy, a group of consultants that were able both to inform and mediate government policy. So if successive governments had not prioritized phonics in the teaching of reading, it's unlikely, although not impossible, that Ruth Miskin training would be so successful. Teach First was started prior to the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund. The interesting thing about Teach First is that it is unlike Teach for America in that it is now almost a mainstream way into teaching. So when Teach First started, like Teach for America, it was an elite route into teaching. It was an elite alternative. Teach First in England, again for the preceding 10 years, had progressively been scaled up to the extent it needed to be delivered almost as a franchise by universities that were winning contracts. So you could go to, for example, Warwick University and do your regular teacher education program, or you could go to Warwick University and you get taught by the same people in the summer school to do a Teach First program. But there was a degree to which Teach First would not exist without successive governments' interest in having them. So again, intermediate in that they were existing, and they have existed after the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund, but they have a history of being involved with policy and being useful to policy. We finally then identified what we call co-created shadow state structures. And this was the category that we found the most interesting. So again, there are different types of enterprises, enterprising charities or sole trader entrepreneurs. These barely, if at all, existed prior to the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund. They were to an extent co-created by the policy entrepreneurs, by the individuals behind these organizations, and the policy need of the government at the time and the Department for Education Policy at the time. So there was a really interesting meeting there of policy and entrepreneur. And there was a strong extent to which these organizations would not be sustainable without the co-creative aspect of the state's involvement. So for example, the Teacher Development Trust was just sort of ticking over prior to the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund grant scheme. The leader of it, the chief executive of it, I think it was his title, was giving himself quite a good salary out of pretty modest income that was coming in from schools. And that was changed by the award of the grant from the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund. The Institute for Teaching, that one I mentioned earlier, didn't really exist at all prior to this. And in fact, it doesn't exist now. The Institute for Teaching merged into another organization and became something else. So it was useful for a very specific moment. Tom Bennett Training, again, as an entity, didn't really exist. The amount of money going into the accounts of Tom Bennett Training was very, very small, and he had hardly any staff, I think one, if I recall, prior to this, prior to winning just under £1 million from the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund. So we think these three are very interesting organizations because they've been selected by the state, by the Conservative government, for this particular purpose to provide across the opportunity areas in England, high poverty areas in England, CPD for teachers. So the co-creation comes from the meeting of the creativity, if you like, of the entrepreneur, the person behind the Institute for Teaching, and the person behind the TDT, and the person who is Tom Bennett, creatively engaging in a way that appeals to and works with the conservative values of that post-2015 Conservative government. So what we noted was that we said this would be identifiable as a new political economy of teacher development. We were noticing a qualitative shift in the mechanisms and the ethos of educational privatization. We were seeing what Ball called a process of substitution, public organizations, deliberative bodies being dismantled and either being substituted by private ones or no other organization filling that space, which was part of a structural reconfiguration of governance, much less open, much less deliberative. And we saw this as driven by an historical fault line in conservatism, particularly British conservatism, that Stuart Hall described as a tension between the free market and the strong state. And one of the interesting things that came through the interviews we did with people who didn't bid were one particular entrepreneur who had started work in England running a substitute teacher agency or a supply teacher agency, could give schools teachers when other people were off, wanted to move into professional development, wanted to be part of the Conservatives' education rollout of initiatives that were important to them. He himself was a Conservative voter and he couldn't get a look in. he would not be awarded any funding. I won't name him, but if there are any English people watching, British people participating, watching in this webinar, they'll probably know him from Twitter, because he's often very critical of what we've noticed, which is a preference for co-creating organizations that you fund with relatively small, 6.4 million pounds is a lot of money, but compared to 3.8 to do a massive program of CPD over a number of years is nothing at all. So that kind of attention to, my mind has gone blank then. I just saw something out of the window here. I expected to be alone. That tension between free market and strong state, what Hall noticed and what we noticed was that market mechanisms will be used because it's a kind of go-to thing to do. You'll go out and you'll ask people to tender, but actually you've got very strong ideas about what you want, how you want it to be delivered, and what the values are, the political values are. So you will control very closely the organizations you work with. And if you can fund them fairly parsimoniously, another great English word, if you can keep them quite keen because you're not giving them a lot of money, they will be beholden to you, and they're much more likely to align themselves with the way you want to do things. So what we also noticed were what we called interdependent relations of power and privilege. Now, a slang for that would be maybe cronyism. The same group of people, I've given you one example from the Teaching and Leadership Innovation Fund 2017, but what other people, if English, British people participating this evening, they will know it is always the same group of people that we've seen awarded contracts since 2015 and before that. It is always the same people who are on review groups, policy groups, advisory groups. It's the same recycling of the same names. And I would go as far to say that there has been no embarrassment about that from the Conservative government, because they're just quite clear that's who they want. And those are the people who they can work with. Those are the people who they can do what they want. So I'm not sure about cronyism, never have been, because there's never such a thing, as many people have said, as pure market relations. You always have preferences about how people are doing things and how they work. But what we've ended up with in teacher development in England is now really a highly experimental, but also very fragmented and fragile system. And this system of teacher development, if you could call it a system, if it is systematic, which again is a question, is against the background of really significant school reform. So in 2010, the number of the equivalent of charter schools or free schools in Swedish context, these are ones that are independently funded by the state. They're not part of a school district. They're not part of a local authority. There are around 200 in 2010 across the whole of England. In 2020, 77% of secondary schools are independent state-funded schools. They're academies, they're charter schools. 77% of the secondary school sector is now outside of local authority control, apparently in a market of provision that parents can choose from, but also very, very strongly controlled directly from the Department of Education. So if you put that background against a very significant background of the way schools operate, how they're governed, how people are recruited into teaching, how budgets are constructed, and then you layer on top of that a new way of providing CPD, never mind new ways of providing initial teacher education, which is another story. Our claim was that you can identify a new political economy of teacher development. So the question is this big, fragile, fragmented experiment, is it sort of England's as a case, just an eccentric outlier. You know, it's a product of personalities meeting, bits of ideology and chaos and disruption and playfulness, and the kind of rhetorical expertise and flourishes that were so important to Conservative education minister like Michael Gove? Or is it something different? You know, is England an example of how the relationship between the state, public deliberative bodies, civil society bodies like universities, like school districts, like local authorities, local government, schools themselves, is the case of England, in this case, specifically concerned with teacher development? Is this a kind of omen of what might come elsewhere in the world? So the sociologist Tony Verger talks about England and Chile as an example of education reform through privatization. So that's all he and his colleagues have already identified that. You know, in all the different types of reform that you can find around the world, England and Chile is reform through privatization. But what we would add to that is to say, yes, it's privatization, but it's privatization with an interesting political economy dimension. The privatization is very strongly in relation to a set of political values. And it's also in relation to pretty austere funding. And it comes in a political tradition in England, in which the state is suspicious of its own involvement in the provision of schooling and the provision of mass education. So the question that I posed, and I would pose for discussion if you were interested in questions, is this just a particular example of disruption and playfulness and rhetorical flourishes and so on? Or is this something quite different in that it's an experiment in which some ideas that have been worked out previously, maybe under a political era like Margaret Thatcher's and Ronald Reagan's, those ideas have matured, and what you're seeing is something that actually is relevant and applicable to other contexts. Now, when we did the study and we started publishing, a lot of what we said was really speculative, really speculative. So our analysis of what was going on had a degree of speculation about it, particularly in the final analysis. However, then along came COVID-19. COVID-19, as it did elsewhere in the world, involved a turn to remote learning. Do you remember the person who invented the IFT, the organization that didn't quite exist when it won 6.4 million? Well, he invented something called Oak National Academy. And Oak National Academy was immediately awarded £300,000 under emergency COVID-19 procurement regulations, and then subsequently 4.34 million. At the same time that was happening, thanks to the brilliant journalist Warwick Mansell, and also the English education newspaper called Schools Week and the editor John Dickens, meanwhile, a consortium of professional associations, the equivalent of the National Association for the Teaching of English or the National Council of Teachers of English, mathematics teachers, history teachers, they put an idea to the government to say, everything's going online, everything's going remote. We've got expertise in subject teaching, and we've got expertise in remote learning. And also at lower cost. Yeah. So in terms of a market, if there'd been a process and a competitive tender and value for money and track record were important parts of that, then that consortium would have had a good go at winning that contract. But they just received an acknowledgement. That's all they got. And then at the end of 2020, in the COVID-19 honours list, that IFT entrepreneur was awarded the British Order of the British Empire. So if we wanted to be convinced, substantiated, that the argument that from a perspective I don't really support, cronyism, or that co-creation of shadow state structures was the way that England was going in terms of education policy, then you just need to read this article in the New York Times, which very comprehensively talks about waste, negligence, and indeed cronyism inside Britain's pandemic spending. So some of the examples that you might have read about would be people who ran bars or pubs being awarded multi-million pound contracts to provide personal protective equipment. They weren't in PPE, personal protective equipment, they were in beer and wine and spirits and hospitality. And yet they were able to win contracts with no track record and against no evaluation in terms of value for money to provide PPE at a time when all that selective dismantling that I mentioned, to use Jennifer Walsh's word, all of that, the stronger welfare state infrastructure around public health in local authorities, testing and tracing, the capacity to provide personal protective equipment, the capacity to act on a pandemic plan had been withered away, completely withered away. So if we needed some support for our initial speculation about what was going on, then COVID-19 and the English government's response to that has provided ample. And again, people watching this from England or from Britain will be familiar with that. So thank you very much for the invitation and for listening. As I said, I've given you what is an analysis of a situation that's evolved over a period of time. The question that we find intriguing, we being Sarah Stedman, Warwick Mansell, David Spenlove, Tamara Tripperstad, who each contributed to these arguments, is this just a kind of momentary aberration and eccentricity? And England's very famous for eccentrics, and I can say that because I'm Welsh. Or is it something more literally ominous? Is it something about a profound change to the way that we provide mass public education and also the way that we provide teacher professional development?
Thank you, Professor Ellis, for the inspiring lecture. It's now time for the Q&A session. Please type your questions in the Q&A chat box so that we can read them out for you. The raise hand function will not be responded. Now, I'd like to pass the time to Professor Goodwin to facilitate the session. Professor Goodwin, please.
Thanks so much. Viv, you always give us a lot to think about. And on the one hand, part of me thinks, are we doomed? What I mean, so much of this has been repeated, historically. So I'll save my questions. I'll start with a couple of questions that are in the Q&A box. But if there's time, I'd love to, sort of poke my head into this. So I have no idea what that was. So a question from Anu. I'm going to butcher your name. My apologies. Relasto Moran says, school systems seem to reproduce and or exacerbate the inequalities that students come to school with. If inequalities are in large part established prior to school age, I'm going to have some argument with that myself, but anyway, how can schools or teachers negotiate the effect of social origins?
Yeah, oh, just a small one then.
Just a small.
I think it is really interesting what we noticed, and I talked about the policymakers we've talked about are very good very rhetorically adept, is they are essentially making crisis arguments about social justice, equity, social mobility. And so they are saying the crisis of inequality, the crisis of uneven performance in schools, or the gap between children who are coming from richer families and poorer families, all of that is very strongly related to the quality of their teaching. So we need to do things very urgently, and we need to be very radical. And then that creates a crisis, and the crisis allows you to do some exceptional things. So the bigger the crisis you create, which I would support the fact that there is a crisis in terms of social justice, and I would agree with the person who asked the question that education tends to reproduce inequality. It needn't do that, but it does do that. The appeal that politicians have had, and the way that they've created a crisis, which people, the general public, the media, journalists and so on would support, you want to do something about it, has allowed them to do some pretty exceptional, pretty radical, pretty bizarre, pretty experimental things. And those things, when you talk about reproducing inequality in schools, and your CPD for teachers is around behavior management and phonics and leadership, then you're offering things to the teachers of certain populations of children that I'm pretty sure they wouldn't want for their own, that narrow diet. But as I say, I think they've been very successful at creating the crisis frame, a social justice, equity, social mobility, particularly frame, through which we see education policy. So I don't know whether I've answered the bigger question, but I've tried to align my answer with the question.
Yeah, I think that it's a very complex question, and there are many assumptions embedded in that question that would require some examination and cause great debate, which we don't have time for. But I think it might be fair to say, well, I know it's fair to say, that building crisis around poor people has allowed the privileged class to maintain privilege. Because you generate income by addressing crisis that actually never gets ameliorated at all. So there's a great deal of there's motivation to continue poverty, so that those who are not poor can actually continue to put food on their own tables. Social origins. You have to do is look at different groups who who are socially privileged in one context and socially disadvantaged in another, and they're the same people. But anyway, that's a fascinating discussion. So let me just, now we have a lot of questions and we're probably not going to have enough time. So let me see if, I'm going to take a question about research. And the question is, and this is from Carlos Soto. Oops, it disappeared. Is there any research that has described some of the everyday realities of these new forms of teacher ed? So, in the sort of enactment of this new, sort of politicized teacher education as a form of economy, what sort of tensions and possibilities have arisen?
So could you just say the questioner's question again?
Carlos Soto, who is.
And what was the question again?
It's about research. Is there any research that has described sort of the impact of this?
I think there is. I think there's quite a lot of it around the world. Marilyn Cochrane-Smith has done interesting studies of independent graduate schools of education. I really like the work of someone like Lauren Gatti from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, who did a really nice book, which was really focused on an alternative teacher preparation program in Chicago. David Spendlove and myself have done a study of policy enactment by teacher educators during that 2010-2014 period, and the fear and the anxiety that they experienced that led them to do some pretty strange things. So yes, there is quite a lot, but I would say there probably needs to be more, and a policy enactment perspective is a really interesting perspective to take, as indeed is an ethnographic perspective. And one of my key co-authors, Sarah Stedman, did a brilliant ethnographic study of different routes into teaching in England for her PhD, including a university-based route and 2 different types of alternative. So yes, there is, and it's good policy enactment perspective, ethnographic perspective. So in terms of the lived experience, there's lots of good, rich stuff out there.
Right. Thinking also of Ken Zeichner.
And Ken Zeichner, yes, absolutely.
Right, who is very sorry, those of you who don't know, Ken is in Washington State. So obviously he's still sleeping right now, but he is looking forward to the live stream of this, or the YouTube version.
Yes.
So, and it makes me think also of the article you and Sarah just wrote for the European Journal of Teacher Education.
That wasn't so much on the lived experience, but I think the lived experience is a really important dimension, because there's a lot of policy sociology, particularly around school reform. There's not so much policy sociology around teacher education reform. There is obviously a lot, but not as much. But there's not as much really good stuff, either from a policy enactment perspective or from an ethnographic perspective, about the lived experience of these practices.
And your mention of Marilyn Cochran-Smith, I know that she has a very recent article, I think it's just online, from The New Educator, where she looked at these independent degree-granting universities.
Yes. Yeah. The other thing I would say is that there are, and this is an interesting question about where does research, academic research end and investigative journalism begin? Warwick Mansell is an outstanding journalist. Well, I could also say he's an outstanding qualitative researcher to some extent. And in the US, I think her name is Jennifer Berkshire, is another absolutely fantastic education journalist who writes about school reform and teacher education reform, often from the perspectives of those people who are going through it. So I think journalism has got something to give to us as well, in terms of the kind of long form reportage of what people actually experience.
Okay. So a question here is about sort of the reactions of schools and school leaders to the way in which cronyism or any other process has sort of affected how funding has flowed. So what has been their reaction? How are they, resisting, acquiescing, shifting directions? Are there things that we can learn from, sort of their responses? And, connected to that is, what's been the impact of the professional development being offered by these various organizations? Is it actually being offered?
Yeah. So you said resisting, acquiescing, all of that.
Yeah.
So you'll find all of that. I mean, it's really interesting that the school reforms in England have really changed direction in terms of school leadership. So the reforms that Margaret Thatcher's government initiated were about giving head teachers, principals more autonomy and more responsibility. And actually, these reforms that have been coming since 2010 have somewhat kind of reduced the authority and the autonomy of the principal or the head teacher, because very often they're working within trusts where there's a chief executive, where the trust does it on a trust model. So like in the United States with the Knowledge is Power schools, or the Uncommon schools, or Academy for Urban School Leadership, in England, you've got ARC, Absolute Return for Kids, Harris Academy Chain, and so on. And what they tend to do then is they produce their own teacher professional development. Indeed, they often produce their own initial teacher education as well as their CPD. So in the book that Warwick and Lauren Gatti and I are writing, we talk about what in manufacturing is called vertical integration. So you run an organization like a charter school chain or a multi-academy trust, and ideally, because very often they are influenced by strong political ideas, you prepare them on the model you want, and you continue to develop them on the model you want. So it's an interesting set of ideas that Jeff Whitty, who was a preeminent British sociologist of education, was noticing just before he died, which is you've got different kinds of teacher professionalism on kind of local models associated with brands, academy chain brands. And increasingly in England, they are interested in both preparing their own and developing their own. So then the transferability of that between chains is quite interesting because they're an ARC, like a KIP teacher or a relay teacher or they are a particular brand. And that's been interesting, the extent to which school leaders or school system leaders above the level of the individual school have started to craft that and plan for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's one way in which TFA has been so successful, Teach for America. So that question, by the way, came from Amy Choi, who is a maritime professor
brilliant.
with us. So very glad that she's joined us for this conversation. So there's a question about policy borrowing. And I know that there's been a bit of work that has come out of Australia about the Australian policy borrowing from bad policy borrowing from the US and the UK. So David Spenlove, who is a colleague and co-author, he's just interested in your take on, is this simply bad policy that other people, this is my question, I don't understand why people, countries, systems copy bad policy, as has happened in Australia. But do you think that this is just going to be sort of a signpost that other people are going to be drawn towards? Is this about money and power ultimately?
I think it is follow the money partly. I mean, I can't speak. I'm not Australian, and I'd probably be defrocked and undeemed if I spoke too much.
There are Australian authors who have written quite a bit about this.
Yes, and it is a thing, and it's a very it's not just under the current Australian government and the current English government. It predates that. But certainly the current federal Australian government has brought out some of the people I've mentioned. Some of the people I've mentioned today in the presentation have been flown to Australia to give the benefit of their insights and to try to influence policy. And then they meet like-minded people here in the kind of policy space. So there's a very famous organization here called the Centre for Independent Studies, which has been going for a number of decades. And Centre for Independent Studies is really interesting because one of their kind of long-term interests has been the welfare state and how it's too big and how Australian taxpayers pay too much tax, and that makes you're not self-sufficient. And so I think there's something here already that is around questioning a liberal model of a welfare state, and then Australian politicians tend to borrow ideas, as you said, and they perhaps sometimes do that on political lines, conservative, liberal lines. What's really interesting, though, which I've noticed here, is the fact that it's a federal system and that the states have primary responsibility for education means that if you've got a left of centre state government and a right of centre federal government, there's an interesting space for negotiation there. And so however much the Australian federal minister will invite Michael Gove, Nick Gibb, Tom Bennett, Ruth Miskin, whoever, to Australia, the chances of their ideas taking hold aren't as good here because there's not a single, quite authoritarian state that can ensure that those ideas are enacted across the whole of Australia. They then have to work in an interesting dynamic with the state governments. So yeah, you see those people here, you get those debates here. The other thing I think is different here is, and particularly in Victoria, where Melbourne's situated, is there seems to be more power in the hands of the grassroots, in the hands of schools. Yeah. Now whether that's absolutely the case, my Australian colleagues will correct me tomorrow. but I notice that in terms of Victorian government education policy is much less directive than English, and that head teachers here still have a lot of autonomy. And I was very interested when I've spoken to some principals here that they have the education minister's mobile phone number on their cell phone. And they will have conversations with the minister. Not all of them, I've only met a few, but the ones I've met have all got James Merlino's number.
Interesting. So we have already come close to the end of our time, unfortunately. So I'll just ask one last question, and this is from Michelle Schweisford. And there are multiple questions here, so I'll just identify one. She talks about a fascinating and infuriating analysis. She thanks you for that. But she says the analysis casts doubt on the impact agenda within UK higher education. Example, the REF impact studies. And the Hong Kong subscribes to the RAE, which is the, as you well know, the precursor. And you've come and talked with us about that. So this whole notion of, research and the impact of research and the relationship to how it shapes practice, sort of intersected by all these sort of political agendas.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm going to answer Michelle's question. I notice there's only 2 minutes left.
Right.
So I might say something provocative, which is, I don't think that the teacher education research is strong in England. And I think there are reasons for that. That's not deficiencies with the researchers, is that they have basically been positioned in a way within faculties of education to prepare teachers to the government model. And there's very little time for them to do research. So to talk about the impact of teacher education research, there's actually very little teacher education research being done because the people who know about it are doing it, don't have time for anything else. The other side of it is I don't think leaders in the UK higher education sector have been very good at all at arguing back. So Michael Gove was superbly effective at arguing for equality or social mobility, bringing up people of color, head teachers of schools that support his particular view, highly effective. I would say that the UK leadership of teacher education and of higher education in the UK has been nowhere near as effective. And until very, very recently, they've been largely silent. And I think some of the things which I didn't talk about today, which are current in the UK, in England, that are really quite shocking, have led to a social media campaign which is promoting university-based teacher education. It's the first time I've seen that degree of activism, that degree of interest in kind of promoting a particular alternative view to the dominant political conservative one. So yeah, I would say the question of impact in teacher education research is really interesting because there's not a lot of it. And the researchers and the university leaders have not been good at arguing back.
Yeah, it's almost as if, I think that's repeated in many, sort of contexts around the world. So it's almost as if we need an academy to sort of learn how to resist and speak back. So just in closing, we are at 6 o'clock. So I'd like to give you a moment to, say a last sentence or two, takeaways, where we should go next in terms of not just practice or policy, but things we can read or, how would you like to close this out?
I think I'd like to close by thanking you for inviting me, Lynn.
Oh, it's been so delightful having you, Viv.
So I really enjoy it. It's one of those strange things where I've no idea if anyone is listening at all. I'm talking at a screen in my office. It's dark outside, and who knows,
I'm listening.
Pardon?
I said I'm listening.
Oh, good. But it's been really good to do. And I think, as I said at the beginning, it's an analysis of a particular situation. What I think is really interesting is whether it is a kind of aberration that you get in the way that maybe, 45 was both a symptom of a problem in American politics and an aberration,
Right.
or whether the experimentation that's gone on is deliberate experimentation, and it is, as Stuart Hall argued actually in 2011, they've been really good of acting on ideas that have been in development for 20 years. And that question, I think, is a really interesting one that I think it's worthwhile everybody pursuing in different parts of the world, and one that that Lauren and Warwick and I are pursuing in the book.
Well, I was being facetious earlier, but we had over 100 people on this Zoom lecture. So lots of people were listening. And unfortunately, there are more questions. Yes, and Sarah says, we are listening, Viv, great talk. And I certainly want to second that. We know that people are listening when there are more questions than we have time for. So please, everyone, it's not possible for you to clap your hands and for us to see this, but please join me in thanking Professor Viv Ellis. It has been such a pleasure and a gift to have you here. It's been great to see you again. It's been far too long. And please do look at Viv's website, because there are lots and lots of resources, lots of ways in which you can sort of continue learning and engaging in this conversation through the research that he's been engaged in. So, Crystal, are you going to close us out, or do I close us out?
Yeah, I can do it. Thank you, Professor Ellis and Professor Goodwin. We understand that you may still have some questions, and if you would like to raise them, please send an email to eduert@hku.hk, which is shown on the screen now. We will relay your questions to Professor Ellis. This is the end of the lecture. Thank you very much for your participation. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye, Viv. Have a good evening.
Thank you.